small newspaper in Northern California, writing about the city council, the school district, the local fishing group. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life. And so, like most Americans, I would skim the headlines on this important issue, accept the confusion that I found, and I would just move on. But then, in fall of 2000, I began to see those images of children throwing stones against tanks in the second Palestinian uprising, and I finally decided to pay attention to just follow the news coverage on this issue and sort of learn what it was about. And when I did that as a journalist, I very quickly noticed that it seemed to me we were getting one-sided coverage. I would hear from and about Israelis in great detail, as we should. Then I expected and waited to hear from and about Palestinians in similar detail, and I noticed that came much less frequently. We do sometimes get those stories now. We sometimes did then, but not nearly as much as we were hearing from and about Israelis. Because of that, when I go around the country now, my effort is to tell people mainly what's not in the media, not to repeat things that you already can get just by turning on any radio station or television broadcast or reading any newspaper. I won't report the important things that are already being well reported to us. Instead, I'll try to fill in the very many important aspects of this conflict that we are not getting from Americans, but that we should, that are extremely newsworthy and significant. Now, we know that everybody always alleges that the media is biased. You know, sometimes opponents on an issue will both say it's biased against them. Sometimes these accusations are not correct. I think as journalists, most of us are trying to do a good job, and I think often we are. But sometimes these accusations are accurate, and we wanted to study the situation with news coverage of Israel-Palestine. We decided to take a study that would be as scientific as possible. My son is in physics and math. I like the idea of a scientific study that anybody elsewhere can try replicating, and they either validate your findings or they show that you're wrong. Ours has been validated. We chose a category that was as immune to subjective bias as possible, was quantifiable, and that was universally accepted as significant. We chose to study how the media reported on deaths among both populations. They're both important. Every single one of those deaths is tragic. We especially focused on the first year of the uprising because first impressions are so powerful. They determine for us the context within which we ever after see a conflict. They determine for us who initiated the violence and who is responding, who is defending their population. To be able to study the media, we needed a baseline. You don't know if the media are doing a good job unless you know what actually went on that they were reporting on. So we needed to know how many human beings were killed in that very first year. Using an Israeli organization, we discovered that 165 Israelis had been killed by Palestinians and 549 Palestinians had been killed by Israelis. How were these deaths covered by our primetime network news shows? Well, we found that ABC, CBS, and NBC reported on Israeli deaths at rates 3 and 4 times greater than they reported on Palestinian deaths. We then looked at a subcategory that I believe is even more significant, the killing of children. All populations feel that children are illegitimate targets of strife. When we learn of their deaths, we are deeply saddened, and I think we're horrified. We are also repulsed that anyone who would kill children. These are therefore especially newsworthy. So again, we needed to answer the very sad question, how many children, and by that we use the international definition of child, 17 and below, and many are far below, toddlers and infants. How many children were killed during that first year by the other side? And we discovered that it was 28 Israeli children killed by Palestinians and 131 Palestinian children killed by Israelis. How were these tragic deaths covered by our primetime network news shows? Well, we found that they reported on Israeli children's deaths at rates up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on the, to me, equally tragic deaths of Palestinian children. Another way of looking at that is this chart, where the dark blue in the Israeli column, Israeli children's column, are the number of follow-up reports about an Israeli child's death, children bearing their parents bearing their children, for example. In other words, these are the number of reports that exceeded the number of deaths that had actually occurred, making it appear to us that Palestinian children are being killed even more often than they really are. It's giving us that impression. Whereas for the Palestinian population, we see that it's the reverse. This large empty column are the Palestinian children's deaths that we never even learned about. So our population is drawing conclusions on this issue in which we're comparing that death rate to that, instead of that to that. Another way of looking at this was to graph this chronologically during the course of that first year. This is from the New York Times, study of the New York Times reporting. The first line here is the New York Times reporting on Israeli children who were killed during that first 12 months. Next, we'll see the curve for the Israeli children who were actually killed during that first year. And as we see, it's a bit lower, since the New York Times also has follow-up reports. But it's following a similar curve. Next, we'll see the curve for the New York Times reporting on Palestinian children's deaths during that first year, which is the red line, following a similar curve, a bit lower, but a similar curve. Next, we will see the curve for the Palestinian children who were actually killed during that first year, their actual death curve. Rational reporting would be reporting along that curve. And yet this is the pattern we found again and again and again. Now, what about 2004? Did the media learn to do